Hello, welcome to all of you. We're here for Dr. Clancy Blair's lecture on self-regulation. The title of Dr. Clancy Blair's talk is Wired for Learning, Early Brain Development and Life Success. We're very pleased to bring Dr. Clancy Blair here from the Department of Applied Psychology in the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development from New York University. Dr. Blair received his bachelor's degree in history from McGill University, and it was history of science, because I thought, first of all, history, what's the link to psychology? So it was a history of science. And then he went on to the University of Alabama at Birmingham and received his master's degree and his doctorate degree in developmental psychology. And because that wasn't enough, he decided to do his master's of public health also at the University of Alabama, and really thinking about sort of child and family health. And Dr. Blair has written extensively on children's self-regulation and executive functions. He's published widely in developmental journals, neuroscience journals, and also education journals. And his research has been funded through the National Institutes of Health, and primarily through the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, also through the Institute of Education Sciences. And I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Blair. But first of all, I want to say hello across Canada to all those of you who are logging in. I hear that there's folks from British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Quebec, who are all participating in this webcast. Thank you.
Great. I don't need that. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today here in the audience and those on the web watching from their computer screens. It's great to be here and to talk to you today. I've so enjoyed my visit to Edmonton and to the University of Alberta. I thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you about the research that my colleagues and I are engaged in. So today what I really want to do is I want to cover as much as possible sort of the gamut of how we're thinking about children, really some, I think, exciting advances in neuroscience that help us understand children's development in ways that are intuitive and that we've thought about children in this way for a long time, and some new information about brain development that I think maps nicely on to traditional thinking about children's development in ways that lead to sort of taking action, in ways that lead to advances, in ways to promote and support children's development over time. So with that, what I focus on, of course, is the effects of experience on children's development, and specifically effects of experience on children's biological development in ways that have implications for their behavior, and effects of experience on their behavior in ways that have implications for their biology. This recursive system that's the sort of hallmark of a developmental psychobiological approach or a developmental science approach. And importantly, we've focused largely historically on effects of parenting on child development, effects of family context, and those are powerful, powerful influences on children's development. But we're also seeing effects of neighborhoods and communities, and importantly schools, and the fact that we can see these effects over and above these powerful effects of family and parenting, I think, is impressive and suggests from a public health standpoint things that we can do related not only to the family but things that we can do in neighborhoods and communities and schools in ways to best promote children's development. And I mean focusing on the whole child, from the biological to the behavioral, and looking at outcomes not only close in time to early childhood in terms of early academic outcomes, but increasingly we're having some very nice longitudinal data into early and later life outcomes and seeing effects from self-regulation early in life on later life outcomes. So with that, right. So when we're talking about children's development, I think it helps to just take a step back and think, what are our goals for children's development generally? There are several, there are many. We could probably develop a pretty long list, but I think importantly we can think of them along these lines, or at least I do, right? So these skills and abilities that enable children to in many ways be flexible, right? So to take initiative, to be exuberant, but to be compliant when needed, right? And that's familiar to anyone who's been a parent or worked with young children or children at any age. To be emotionally expressive, right? To run, to play, to be a child, but also to regulate that expression when we need them to, right? To sustain attention and stay focused, but also to run and play, to not be focused, to be able to to have that flexibility, and then to interact socially with other children and adults in ways that allow for conscientiousness, or that are exemplary examples of conscientiousness. Right? So I think one way to think about these general goals for children is the way in which children become self-directed in their behavior, right? This ability to regulate, to be flexible. And the way that self-regulation develops, what we're interested in is this process of other regulation to self-regulation. So early in life, of course, in infancy, almost all regulation is other regulation. The regulation of temperature, the regulation of feeding, the regulation of sleeping. This all comes from the primary caregiver. When those are established well enough for the primary caregiver to get a good night's sleep and to go on and do some other things in their life besides full-time child care, that morphs to helping children regulate attention, regulate emotion, and then regulate thinking, regulate activities, and so on and so forth. So much so that around the age of 5 or 6 or maybe even 7, children are really at an age in which they're able to have an understanding of their own actions in the world in ways that allow for this sort of compliance, sort of perspective taking, beginning to take direction of their own activities. And I think really that's a definition of school readiness. I've argued that what we're looking at when we're looking at school readiness is children are at an ability, they're able to regulate their thinking, their behavior, their attention in ways that allow them to participate in formal school environments. And that's really some of the goals of school readiness. So how does this process happen from other regulation to self-regulation? Well, in part, of course, it happens through these warm, sensitive interactions with primary caregivers. And this is the stock and trade of child development research, links to attachment, bonding, and so on and so forth. But these important, so here the shared affect, here soothing and calming. Of course, the role of dads, they play an important role as well. This sort of structured oversight as children become older. And we have, I think, increasingly good ways of measuring that, and increasingly good data indicating that children who experience this kind of early care are better at regulating their attention and their emotions, and end up exhibiting higher levels of executive functions, these higher order complex thinking skills that we're so interested in now. But self-regulation also emerges from individual differences or characteristics of infants that are present really at birth in terms of attention, emotion, and physiological characteristics that are present. So, right, what do we know? We've learned a tremendous amount about infant attention over the last 2 decades, right? Infants are attending, they're learning statistically, right? There are examples of infant learning when infants are asleep. They're hearing language and they're attending to regularities. They're attending to regularities, right? And this is seen simply in this characteristic, this phenomenon of habituation, right? Infants will look at a novel object, they'll look at it slightly longer, the longer it's present, they'll eventually shift their focus away from it, and this sort of habituation, right? And then presenting a novel object, we'll see that infants will shift attention to the novel object, and then we'll have an attention decrement to that as well. And one of the very interesting things about research on infant attention is it seems to have this sort of executive function, almost like characteristic very early in life, 6 weeks, 6 months, in which infants will attend longer to unexpected novel events as opposed to expected novel events. You may be familiar with some of this research, but here's an example of an object placed in a case. A screen comes up, a second object's added behind the screen, the hand leaves empty, the screen drops, there should be 2 objects there, right? We're all on the same page in terms of what should be there, in terms of simple math, 1 + 1. So these are 6-week to 6-month-old infants. But when the screen drops and someone underneath the case took one of the things away, unobserved by the infant, revealing only 1 object, infants will look reliably longer at the impossible outcome relative to the possible outcome. And it's almost like they're surprised, right? This is called the violation of expectation. Isn't that a nice psychological term for this phenomenon? Basically, they're surprised. This is an unexpected event, and that's been demonstrated with mathematics, with physical objects, physical properties of objects, a number of things. And I don't know, we don't want to speculate too broadly as to what's going on in there with the young infant mind, but clearly infants are attending to regularities in their experience in ways that lead them to develop expectations about the world, right? Whether these are consciously represented or not doesn't matter at all. We don't care about that. We're just interested in this phenomenon, right? So this is a really important clue as to what's going on in infancy and what parents are attending to, the sort of stage they're setting for children in terms of providing the regularity of experience, providing these sorts of environments for children that allow for developing these representations such as they are. The other part of regulation that's very important, that's up and running really early, is emotion, right? Emotion is the primary way in which infants communicate with the world. The caregivers, whether they're unhappy or happy or sad or hungry or need a diaper change or so on and so forth, emotion is the primary form of communication. And the interesting thing is, infants will vary, of course, in the amount of reactivity that they have to an emotional event, but they'll also vary in these regulatory strategies, ways in which infants regulate emotion automatically, right? So self-soothing, orienting to a caregiver, like here, or soothing with this in response to scary events or frustrating events or other things. And so I think a primary way in which we go from other regulation to self-regulation is caregivers picking up on these signals in infants, providing, not trying to do away with emotional reactivity and emotional response, but help infants come to regulate their emotion in a variety of strategies, some which become more effortful and conscious with time, but which begin sort of non-volitionally and more automatic. And of course, the other part of this that we're very interested in is a physiology that's underneath all of this, right? When we experience an emotional response or when we experience surprise, what happens to our heart rate? What happens to our hormone levels? Well, we can feel our heart rate. We can't really feel our hormones change so much, but we do when they're elevated over time and we feel frazzled. That's high levels of cortisol messing with our system in certain ways. And so what we're very interested in young children is the extent to which this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which potentiates the release of cortisol, which is the slower acting component of the stress response system, and more fast acting components of the stress response, how they're related to emotion and attention. And when emotion and attention are well regulated, physiology should be well regulated as well. When emotion and attention are poorly regulated, physiology can be poorly regulated as well, and this has implications for thinking about the development of the brain, as I want to talk about, and the development of the types of behaviors and cognition, executive function that we're interested in with this, right? So what I see this as I mentioned before, in the context of school readiness, the beginning of self-regulation, its roots in other regulation through the regulation of emotion and attention and stress physiology, sets the stage for the development of these executive functions, right? So executive functions are sort of conscious, higher order, effortful, volitional thinking skills, holding information in mind and working memory, inhibiting or overriding an automatic response, flexibly shifting attention between relevant but distinct dimensions of a given object or task. And you can see these are present really in many things that we do throughout our day, throughout our lives. They're very much a part of schooling, right? When we need to sort of think about reading, right? How complex the English phonology is. You need to inhibit a representation of the letter C as a k sound, as an S sound, right? Or in mathematics, when you need to think about transivity, how addition and subtraction are very similar, right? But they're the flip side of each other. Or different ways in which one needs to represent a given object or color. And so what we'll do is we're very interested in the way in our research and the extent to which changes in physiology and emotion and attention are related to the development of executive functions in the way that sort of the entrainment of executive functions by primary caregivers, but also perhaps through preschool environments, school curricula may be very important for supporting children's healthy development in terms of the development of executive function, right? So what I've been describing is this sort of hierarchical relation, physiological, emotional, and cognitive. And as I mentioned before in a talk yesterday, this is a recursive system, right? We tend to think of self-regulation in general in terms of executive functions and their downward control, and of course that's a hallmark of these things, right? We can use working memory to regulate emotion. We regulate attention when we're engaged in an executive function task, shifting flexibly between dimensions of a given task. And of course, we can calm ourselves down, right, through these effortful volitional strategies. But at the same time, and by the same token, these are bottom-up processes as well. So changes physiologically can be registered emotionally that can short-circuit executive function as well as support executive function over time. So we're thinking of this holistically as an aspect of children's development, right? And here, as I said, just a definition of executive functions, including working memory, inhibitory control, flexible shifting of attention, and the idea that they're important for planning and problem solving, for taking perspectives, for sort of a metacognitive awareness, reflecting on experience, which is so essential for doing well in life and in school. And so here, probably one of the best ways to illustrate executive functions is to talk a little bit about how we measure them in young children. So this is a task that's called the peg tapping task. It's a very simple task that I described in a lecture this morning, in which the instruction to the child is when I tap one time, you tap 2 times, okay, and when I tap 2 times, you tap 1 time. As I said this morning, this is a task that really no 3-year-olds can do. They can understand the rules, but they will mimic the tapping of the experimenter. When I tap 1 time, they tap 1 time. When I tap 2 times, they tap 2 times, despite my repeated insistence that they do otherwise, and their acknowledgement that they understand the rule. It sort of just doesn't stick. Really, 5- and 6-year-olds can do this pretty well. And most people beyond that age do so as well. It's really around the age of 4 that you see a tremendous amount of variability, and kids will acknowledge the rule, they'll hang in there for you with a few trials through 1 and 2 taps, but then it's like the rule just evaporates and goes away. And what I think we're picking up on here is the development of prefrontal cortex, really in that age range, specific to this task. Now, there are much more difficult types of executive function tasks that I can challenge, that would challenge any of us in this room. This is a good one for age 4 specifically. With this area of the brain. And then, so that's more the working memory inhibitory control aspect of executive function. Here's more the attention shifting aspect of executive function, or this flexibility. And the task here is to point to 2 things on this page that are alike. Show me 2 things on this page that are the same. And usually that's the most salient dimension of shape. Here, these are both teapots. That's right. That's great. Those are both alike. Now, can you show me 2 things that are alike on this page in a new way? 2 things that are alike, but in a different way. And the task is to shift from the dimension of shape to the dimension of size. These are alike because they're both small, right? You can't say they're both yellow because they're all yellow, right? So you have to shift from the dimension of shape to the dimension of size. And here we can run through 15 or 16 sort of different shifting trials like this to measure executive function. And this is another one that works well in that pre-K to kindergarten age range. Here I've gone through some of these. What we needed there, this is another sort of a shifting type task where the instruction is to touch on the same side of the screen that the arrow is pointing to. It's pretty simple when the arrow and the response location are congruent. It gets a lot more difficult when the response location and the arrow are incongruent, and then it's more difficult still when they're intermixed, right? So when we have the response location being congruent or incongruent with the location of the arrow. And then these other tasks that I mentioned, working memory, in which we have what colors in this house, what animals in this house, what animal was in this house, what color, what animal, what color, what animal. We can scale this up and make this more difficult by adding more animals and houses, by switching between animal and house as a response, and making the animal the color of the dog blue or the bird red, so to speak. It's a more difficult task because the stimulus properties are bound there. So we're using these to measure executive function is the point that I want to make here. And we're very interested in this because we think that these are pretty good indicators of prefrontal cortex development. So we know from a lot of neuroscience research over the last 20 years, primarily through functional magnetic resonance imaging, but also through neuropsychology in instances of damage to prefrontal cortex, to this area of the brain, whether through trauma or through illness, that this area of the brain is associated with the ability to do these types of tasks, and it's associated with real-world consequences. Individuals with damage to prefrontal cortex have an enormous amount of difficulty planning, solving problems, coming to conclusions, making decisions based on emotional and other information, that coordination response, right? So executive functions perform this coordinating role in the brain in which they're coordinating streams of information from other brain areas, including information about emotion and stress, right? So when we experience stress, we produce these hormones that I alluded to before: cortisol, the end product of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, norepinephrine, which is a product of the adrenal system, and they influence prefrontal cortex in specific ways, right? So as experience is registered rapidly in the limbic system, these structures here, right, it potentiates levels of these stress hormones, catecholamines, dopamine, norepinephrine, and cortisol, that signal to prefrontal cortex and to say, hey, something's going on, arousal is occurring, we need to feed back. And the important point of this slide is that this is a recursive system, right? It feeds back on and turns these down into acceptable levels. And the idea here is what we're looking at when we're trying to measure executive function development is this sort of the integrity of this system, right? Executive functions map well onto children's ability to regulate emotion. They map well onto children's ability to regulate behavior. And interestingly, they map pretty well on their ability to regulate physiology, stress hormones, cortisol in particular. And so what we see is that this is what I've just talked about before, the limbic system controls, the limbic system here, these midbrain structures here, control these levels of stress hormones that act as neuromodulators in prefrontal cortex. And as they rise a little bit, they potentiate neural activity in prefrontal cortex, and we see that they're associated with a higher level of executive function. But at very high or very low levels, so very under-aroused or very over-aroused, they will short-circuit executive functioning for the most part. So, as I've said before, this is the classic inverted U-shaped curve of Yerkes and Dodson related to anxiety and performance. It's good to be a little bit stressed out when you go to take the big test or go to the job interview and so on and so forth. And that's specific to complex learning and executive function types of tasks. Simple learning and reactivity and fear conditioning is a more linear relationship. So the idea here would be, if we think executive functions are important, and we know they're important for doing well in school and life, and we know they're associated with the development of prefrontal cortex, how is it that children come to regulate physiology in ways that help keep them at the top of this curve? Can we structure environments in ways that help children stay here rather than here or here over time, with the idea that this would be measurable in emotion and attention and also in stress hormones? So this is a big task, right? It's a very difficult sort of problem to try to solve, but at least it gives us a framework within which we want to try to design environments within which children are situated in. And it's very important because, as you may or may not know, the brain is developing slowly, prefrontal cortex in particular, over time, right? So prefrontal cortex really isn't mature and it's still changing into young adulthood. And then it's even changing again after that, but it's just getting worse and worse and declining over time, like my poor brain. But here, this is a slide from Jay Geed in his lab. He's an intramural researcher at NIH, and this is from cross-sectional brain imaging from about 400 participants. And what you see is as it gets bluer, that's mature. So there are relatively few areas of brain that are at mature levels at age 5. But as you see here, what would be about the teen, early, middle childhood years up through young adulthood, prefrontal cortex, this area of the brain here, is the last to mature and to reach sort of functional, high levels of white matter myelination and gray matter thinning over time. So we're really interested in sort of this age and the extent to which experience with family, experience with peers, and experience in school may be affecting the development of these areas of the brain through those stress hormone processes that I talked about before. Right? And the question is, so executive functions are essential for school readiness and achievement, for doing well in life. Can executive function self-regulation be a primary way in which early disadvantage is really compromising children's development? So thinking about the effects of poverty, we know that poverty environments are associated with elevated levels of stress hormones in kids in ways that could sort of preferentially interfere with executive function development. Is it the case that we see these links between early disadvantage, stress physiology, being stressed out, and executive function deficits leading to problems with early school success, leading to later life problems? And if so, what can we do about it? Right, so several studies, as I mentioned, my own included, the work of Gary Evans and a number of other researchers have shown that poverty is associated with elevated levels of stress physiology. So cortisol is the end product of the HPA axis, but also elevated levels of catecholamines as well. And through this mechanism is associated perhaps with executive functions and school readiness. So we've shown this in one paper here in which what we saw was status characteristics of families in poverty in a longitudinal study that we've conducted are associated with parenting early in life, which is in turn associated with these cortisol levels, which affects executive functions over time. And this was specific to executive function and not to a measure of IQ. And several studies have also shown that this self-regulation difficulty, right, in addition to this sort of model here, which is specific to early life, we also have examples in which self-regulation problems early in life are related to later life outcomes. And this is from a longitudinal study that was conducted in Dunedin, New Zealand, a birth cohort. Children were seen in early childhood and followed into young adulthood. And what we have here are sort of quintiles of self-control measured in a variety of ways. I won't go into it. But here, individuals with the lowest levels of self-control in childhood have much higher levels of single parenthood, right? They are much more likely to have an adult criminal conviction. They're much more likely to have trouble with finances. They're much more less likely to have high income and financial independence, and so on and so forth. They're more likely in this, with this data set as well, to show problems with gambling and a variety of things. And the remarkable thing, I think, about this data is it's not so surprising that this is the case, but the linearity here, right? This sort of linear association between self-regulation measured in childhood and these outcomes measured in adulthood at age 32. So it suggests to us, these and other sources of information, that really focusing on self-regulation may be among the most important things that we can do in trying to safeguard or promote children's development, particularly in the conditions of poverty. So what can we do about it? So there are a couple, but not many yet, that have experimentally demonstrated that changes in self-regulation are related to changes in the sort of life outcomes that we're interested in. And here's one that I talked about today that was conducted by my colleague at New York University. She was then at the University of Chicago, Sibel Raver, called the Chicago School Readiness Project. And this was really focused on behavior management, behavior control for children in Head Start. So think of classrooms, Head Start classrooms in the United States and Chicago, in which there are some very, very acting out kids who are really sort of hijacking the climate of the classroom, so much so that it's hard to accomplish anything. And through a behavior management strategy that was provided to teachers and a mental health consultant as well for the classrooms, they found that they were able to change the classroom climate and to change self-regulation in kids, right? The idea that changing the climate should reduce the self-regulation demand. Kids aren't over-aroused or shut down because of the chaos in the classroom. Increasing attention on would increase their attentional focus and executive function, and thereby learning outcomes. And sure enough, that's what they saw. So here in an effect size metric of about less than half a standard deviation, an effect of this program in an experimental evaluation, so a randomized design, on executive function. on observed measure of attention and impulsivity, and effects on vocabulary, letter naming, and early math. And here in an analysis, a mediation analysis, some of this effect on executive function or on attention impulsivity was mediated the treatment effect on the academic outcomes. So here's what the mediated effect size is. So part of that effect here that we saw, that's about half standard deviation on letter naming and early math skills, is attributable to some effect on self-regulation, right? Not all of it. And it raises some important issues and questions that we want to consider in terms of we don't want to focus exclusively on self-regulation and executive function. We definitely want to focus on those, but we also need to understand how the best way to provide information to kids to promote school readiness over time and early academic success. And self-regulation, I think, is an important part of this process, right? But perhaps it's worth considering we are pretty good at maybe providing information to kids about mathematics, about letters, about numbers. Certainly, we put a lot of research effort into that. What we've been paying less attention to and are less good at, perhaps, has been fostering children's self-regulation so they're in a physiological, a mental state prepared for learning, that they can make use of this information in productive ways over time. And then another that I think is very promising that I talked about before would be the Tools of the Mind project. The Tools of the Mind program. And this is, again, it's a comprehensive curriculum. Sabel's study here, the Chicago School Readiness Project, was more of an add-on to the classroom. Tools of the Mind is a comprehensive curriculum. It involves some of these behavior management strategies, but mainly the way that it works is fostering self-direction in learning activities for children through structured play opportunities. And I won't say too much more about that, but it's designed to impact both self-regulation and literacy in mathematics and early learning. And it really is an approach that I think requires teachers a little bit to change their mindset of how the classroom is run, because the teachers less ostensibly or manifestly in charge and more behind the scenes in encouraging children in their play and in these sorts of learning activities that the curriculum sets up for children. So as you may be aware, Adele Diamond evaluated a preschool version of Tools of the Mind in a small sample and saw effects on executive function. And these effects on executive function were indeed correlated with children's academic outcomes, but this isn't a randomized design demonstrating the effects on academic ability. This is the experimental result, the effects on executive function, not necessarily on academics, but we would expect that they would be there. And I've been engaged in an evaluation of the kindergarten version of the curriculum, which is very similar to the pre-K version, except it's a little more complex in terms of the types of learning activities that children are going through. So they're visiting these different centers and engaging in pairs of 2 or groups of 3 or 4 in these different learning activities. And the important thing about Tools of the Mind in kindergarten is children are planning their learning activities, right? They use this sort of template to plan what they're going to do through their school day, to connect it what they've done in the past, in the prior day, and then to enact their school day with a sort of future-oriented orientation, right? And so, and the pre-kindergarten version is, as I mentioned, based on sort of socio-dramatic play. Here, this is based more, the play in the kindergarten version is based on a fictional narrative. Based on a series of books, the Magic Treehouse books. And this would be, one of the books was focused on pirates. So here children have constructed with the teacher sets and props and so on and so forth. And they use this and embed learning activities within the fictional narrative as a primary way of engaging children in the classroom and in the classroom activities. And so in our evaluation of this, we did see effects of the Tools of the Mind kindergarten program on mathematics, on reading, and on working memory. And here we saw effects on vocabulary and on attention and on reasoning ability that were specific to really high poverty schools. So we have some evidence in this analysis that it does seem to work across the board across the range of socioeconomic status for all children to a certain extent on some of our outcomes. But on others, we're seeing really substantially larger effects than we're seeing here that are specific to poverty schools, particularly on this vocabulary and on reasoning ability as measured by a couple of things. We've also seen effects in this evaluation on stress physiology and as well on the ability to regulate attention in the face of emotional distraction. So in many ways, it looks to us like the curriculum is working as expected, sort of with these kind of across-the-board findings in terms of not only the academic outcomes, but the executive function type outcomes, the attention regulation outcomes, as well as the stress physiology. And then most encouraging for this, we were able to follow these kids into the first grade, some of them, and what we saw was an effect on growth in reading over time and also growth in vocabulary. So again, this indicates to us that the curriculum is working as expected, that this approach to early education that focuses on self-regulation, it can promote both self-regulation and academic outcomes. And what we're seeing is hopefully that kids are more engaged in learning and growing faster in their academic abilities as a result of this, right? And then I don't want to oversell tools of the mind by any stretch. I am fortunate to have been involved in evaluating the tools of the mind, and I really, really like its approach. I think it's a good one, but I think there are many good approaches. Any approach that's child-focused, that's child-directed, that allows children to initiate learning activities and follow through with them under the guidance of the teacher, but not directed by the teacher, I think is a good one. And I think this characterizes Montessori education. And you may be familiar with this evaluation of Montessori by Angelina Lillard. It was conducted in Milwaukee. It wasn't a randomized controlled trial. The tools of the mind research that I just talked about in kindergarten was a randomized controlled trial, a cluster randomized controlled trial randomized at the school level. This was a lottery system at a charter school in Milwaukee in which parents applied to get their kids in. And they had results for 5-year-olds here. As you can see, there are effects on academic sorts of outcomes. There's effect on executive function and false belief understanding and aspect of social cognition and other things, and less what they call ambiguous rough and tumble play, so sort of externalizing types of behaviors. Those are seen at age 5, but then results are also present at age 12 from this curriculum. We don't have any, the tools of the mind is really specific to pre-K and kindergarten now. I think it speaks to an approach to education that may extend through K to 8 or maybe even K to 12, but I think these results as well are very encouraging from Montessori. So what I want to argue for from this, but before I do that, I want to say this. So I've been talking about sort of pre-K to K, but I started out talking about parenting, right? So what about that? Are there ways in which we can really affect what happens early in ways that would set the stage for learning in pre-K and kindergarten? And I think, yes, we could definitely through appropriate sorts of parenting programs, especially for families living in poverty. And we have an evaluation of one of these programs. I think there are several that are good ones that are out there. The play and learning strategies developed by Susan Landry at the University of Texas. It's a scripted curriculum over about 14 lessons that can be delivered through home visits. It's a video-based program in which the home visitor is introducing an aspect of positive parenting to the parent through video, then discussing it, and then the parent, him or herself, enacts it while being video recorded. And then the home visitor and the parent critique the parent's behavior over time and ways to improve it. So, of course, if you've seen yourself on video, video can be a pretty powerful agent of behavior change. Another one that I think is very good is this ABC Attachment and Biobehavioral Catch-Up program developed by Mary Dozier at the University of Delaware. It's very attachment-based and has an almost clinical orientation in which the home visitor is observing the parent interacting with the child over an hour or two and sort of catching the parent at being good is the idea. So commenting on behavior in the stream of experience can also be very effective in behavior change. And evaluations of both PALS and ABC have been very promising. And in fact, in one evaluation of the ABC program, Mary and her colleague Phil Fisher demonstrated that the program did, in fact, change parenting behavior, and it, in fact, helped change physiology in terms of cortisol levels, in terms of the children of the caregivers receiving the ABC program. That was also in an experimental design. So one of the points that I want to make here is that the U.S. Administration for Children and Families, which oversees the Early Head Start program, has gotten very interested in this. They've gotten very interested in the idea that early Head Start in particular, but Head Start as well, could help counteract the effects of poverty on stress physiology and the development of executive functions, and they're funding 6 independent studies to examine the effects of things like PALS, which is a program that we're using in our evaluation, and the ABC program as well. And we're looking at the ways to validate this relation between poverty and stress. And most importantly, I think, the extent to which we can implement things like PALS or the ABC program through Early Head Start, right? So there are many issues associated with workforce development and training that I think need to be addressed whenever we're thinking about how we're going to implement something like this. We may have a good idea of what we want to do. We may be pretty sure we know what an effective program is. What we know a lot less about is the extent to which we can actually implement those with some fidelity in ways that we would expect them to have good effects on children's outcomes, right? We need to attend to workforce development issues. We should think about self-regulation and executive function in the home visitor, as well as in the parent, as well as the development in the child, because those are the examples that are going to be most relevant. All right, so just wrapping up here, leaving some time for questions. I just want to make a few points about what I've been talking about, right? This idea that we're focused on healthy child development in a variety of ways, and I think the stuff that I've been talking about in terms of self-regulation and its relation to stress physiology and the effects of stress physiology on brain development are very important because they jibe with or are consistent with our more traditional notions of what's good for children, right? And how to support children's development. And I think what it does is it gives us a language of thinking about development across levels. Behavior is certainly key and paramount and perhaps in many ways most important, but it's also important for us to think about what's behind that in terms of brain activity, in terms of stress physiology, or faster, probably harder to observe processes in terms of children's ability to control attention or shift attention appropriately, or to regulate emotion in a variety of ways. These may be less observable, but very, very important within this hierarchy of self-regulation that I've been describing, and we have good ways of measuring these, right? We can incorporate these in some of our evaluations of educational curricula or home visiting programs or other things like that. So thinking about multiple influences or self-regulation at multiple levels, I think can help us frame our efforts a little better. So the other thing that I want to talk about is, so I've been talking about stress physiology, and I hope I've communicated this effectively in terms of the regulation, the flexible regulation of stress. It isn't that we want to avoid stress completely. I think one of the goals is the ability to recognize and handle stress, and that this begins early, this flexible regulation. It's not inherently harmful, it's something to be managed, and what we want to do in being thoughtful in our approaches to children's development and parenting or teaching or other things is allowing children the space to manage stress, right? To try to handle the things that they're doing. And I think this sort of scaffolding and so on and so forth, we've talked about it in parenting and in teaching for some time, and I think that's the idea. It's something to be managed that's controllable as opposed to uncontrollable, right? And we can structure parenting programs, educational environments in ways that help children to develop these abilities, right? And then finally, I know there's a lot of interest in executive functions. I think these are a great construct that help us describe the sorts of cognitive skills and abilities that we think are very important for children's development and success in life. We're learning an increasing amount about them. We know that they are dependent on effective self-regulation. They also assist with self-regulation. They're likely one aspect of these SES-related gaps in achievement, but they're not the whole story, right? So it's a sort of important point where traditionally we've thought of these sort of SES-related gaps in achievement, poverty-related gaps in achievement as sort of information deficit. We just need more reading instruction. We just need more math instruction. Children are understimulated. And that may be certainly an aspect of it, right? But this is a somewhat different mindset when we focus on self-regulation, right? That it could be overstimulating, that children are really developing in ways that aren't conducive to sort of holding on to information in working memory or flexibly shifting attention, nor perhaps should they be. If they're in very disadvantaged environments, it may be beneficial to be more reactive. So it's not sort of a traditional understimulation notion, it's an overstimulation type of notion. And both are probably relevant, right? It's not an either or. We want to think about those together. And, right, this idea, that's what I've just been describing. It's a sort of a different approach. It's not sort of an input-output approach. Like if I just provide you with more information about reading, or if I just provide you with more information about mathematics, you should be able to take that information up and do well. And perhaps that's true to a certain extent, but I think self-regulation is a nice complementary view to that, right? And what we can do with helping children become efficacious in that way. So the idea that just to wrap up, I think we have a lot of interest in this concept of resilience. And I think this speaks to this idea of resilience in children in important ways, in that resilience isn't something that's inherent to the child or even inherent to the environment in which the child's in, but a combination of the two. And this idea that, again, with stress is not inherently harmful, but something to be controlled and is controllable, and the extent to which we're arming children in disadvantaged or disadvantageous context or facing adversity with ways to exert some control, to control some aspect of their experience in ways that would be expected to lead to benefits over time, I think is a useful way of thinking about this in this general construct of resilience, which I think has a lot of traction and a lot of interest, but can be a complicated construct to discuss. So with that, I want to stop so we have some time for questions. I have a lot of collaborators on the research, Penn State University, UNC Chapel Hill, New York University, and the collaborators on the Tools of the Mind research, the developers Deborah Leong and Elena Bedrova in particular, and with funding from the National Institutes of Child Health and Human Development and the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the funding arm in the United States of the Department of Education, which has, I think, really been a benefit to educational research in the United States to have funds dedicated specifically to educational research. So with that, I want to stop. Thank you again for your time and attention and for coming here in person and for on the web as well. And I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Clancy, for that great talk. And I do want to, first of all, just acknowledge the supporters who brought Clancy here. I neglected to that. So the Department of Psychology and the Department of Human Ecology here at the university. Also the Community University Partnership for Children, Families, and Communities through the Faculty of Extension, and ACCFCR for also supporting this webcasting. So with that, does anybody have some questions for Dr. Blair? I have a mic that you need to speak into for the web. Well, you have one on the web. Okay.
So, Dr. Clancy, my first question is from a health region. They work in population health promotion, and they said we don't have mental health consultants, especially for the early years.
Yeah.
What else could we present to schools for options?
So it depends on the age of the child at which you're focusing on, but if we're talking about sort of pre-K through grade 5 or 6, there are many different good programs that are focused on emotion knowledge and emotion regulation. The Promoting Alternative Thinking Skills PATHS program that's developed by Mark Greenberg is one. The Incredible Years, Carolyn Webster Stratton is another. I was talking with a student today about a specific one that's here in Edmonton. I can't recall the name. I think it was Strong Start. But there are several of these programs that are focused specifically on emotion management and were developed specifically for working with children with behavior management problems, conduct disorder.
So the next question from the web was, can you extrapolate at all about teaching children self-regulation and maybe suggest some resources for parents, teachers, care providers, etc.?
That's a really good question. One that I would say would be to start with those programs, PATHS, Mark Greenberg. There's another second step. The other is, I don't know of specific resources for parents and parenting per se, other than to begin to look through, I think many of the ingredients of sort of classic parenting approaches contains some of these, the idea of scaffolding behavior, of working with children to develop strategies, those sorts of things. I don't know of specific resources for parents per se. It's tricky that way. The information on tools of the mind on the web is quite useful, though. It describes a lot of the activities that take place in the kindergarten classrooms and some of the pre-K classrooms, and some of the thinking behind those activities in ways that I think are understandable and intuitive for individuals working with kids.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
One over there.
No, way over here. If you could hold on 1 second. You're speaking to the webcast.
One of the things that comes to mind in the concepts of development and self-regulation is that of attachment styles.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about these early on programs, the ones before Tools of the Mind, and if there's, regardless of socioeconomic status, if there's certain friction or resistance in seeing development within different kids?
That's a good question. Currently, the evaluations of the ABC program in PALS have been conducted mostly with families living in poverty, and they've taken really well. They've sort of stuck really well. It isn't that parents are opposed in any way to this specific notions of working with their children. They're surprised by them sometimes. Oh, I didn't know. I wasn't aware I was behaving that way. Yeah, that's a better way of solving that sort of problem. It works to everyone's interest. And so I think one of the things that we're interested in is, because we've been talking about the effect of poverty and stress on the development of children's executive function, one thing that we haven't talked about that's a very obvious point with this is the effect of that on parents' executive function ability. And they may have less time. We know that when we're faced with stress, we know that when we're worrying about bills and other things like that, we have less time to reflect on our own experience. We're stressed out. We perseverate in our attention on certain things. And we know as a parent, anyone who's tried to be a good parent, you really need to reflect on it. You really need to reflect and take a step back sometimes and try to get out of the stream of experience. And I think that's what these are doing. So we're very interested in the evaluation of PALS that we're conducting. I don't know of any data on this yet. We're collecting it, the extent to which it's maybe affected parents' executive function and parents' stress levels as well, which would be a very nice result should it show up. Maybe too much to ask for or expect, but certainly we'd love to see that.
I have another question from the web, and that is, how can community play a role in helping children develop their executive functioning?
That's a really good question. I think we know through a variety of data, so some of the data that I presented today, much more data that are available, that we do understand ways in which conditions in which children are growing up are very much influencing their biological development, very much influencing their cognitive development, social and emotional development. We have that information. We have paid good tax money to collect the data to support these conclusions. We need to begin to act on this, right? So I would say if communities can talk to people in local, federal, provincial government, state government in the U.S., really work in ways that can marshal resources so that they're used in ways that support what we know, right? I'm still amazed that it doesn't happen as much as it does. But I think that's probably the best thing that we could do as communities, is try to look at this information and look at these different programs and see how what we're doing currently does or does not map on to some of this way that we're thinking about children's development. And if it doesn't map very well to it, are there ways that we could change it? Are there ways that we could enact our programs or spend our money somewhat more wisely that are in line with what we understand about children's development?
So now this is my question. How long do you think a program needs to be in place and mapped before you would actually be able to see any type of
That's a really
result?
good question. I think what we know less well, I think we've learned a lot sort of about the neurobiology of executive functions, the neurobiology of stress, measuring parenting, those sorts of things. What I think we know less well is how is it that we best implement these types of programs. So if I come to a teacher and I say, you know what, I think Tools of the Mind is a better way of doing this. I would really like you to do Tools of the Mind. And actually, I've done this before. And you get a variety of responses. It definitely jives with some teachers' mindset and the way they want to run their classroom, but for other teachers, it doesn't at all. In fact, teachers who may have been teaching for 4, 5, 10 years, they've gotten pretty good at what they do. They have a sense of it, and it may or may not jibe with what I'm asking them to do in Tools of the Mind. So I would need to know, really, as much as I could from an empirical standpoint, how I best introduce this information to someone, how I go about implementing it with a high level of fidelity, not just with people who really want to do it, but with people who are on the fence or even actively opposed to this. And maybe I'm explaining it wrong, right? I mean, I think I might need to take a step back. So what I'm describing is this sort of area of prevention research called implementation science, which might seem like the simplest and easiest thing in the world, which has proven to be one of the more complex and difficult things you could ever want to study, is how things get implemented well. It's a complicated problem. It's almost a philosophical problem as well as an empirical problem. So that's what I would say.
Hi. I'm wondering that you mentioned quite a bit about what teachers' roles are in self-regulating or increasing self-regulation, which seems to be more of a pedagogical aspect of education. But I'm wondering about, does curriculum have a role in addressing some of these issues? I'm somebody that works on curriculum right now.
That's a great question. And I wish I were a more articulate spokesman for the sort of curricular aspects of Tools of the Mind, because I do think it contains good ways of teaching kids about letters, about numbers, about words, and about reading. I wonder, and I'm going to sort of answer your question with a question, because I don't know the answer, so I'm going to answer your question with a question. What if we are pretty good, sort of curricular-wise, at providing children with information, right? That actually between different sort of approaches, and I'm sure there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of different sort of curricula that are out there for teaching early reading, teaching early math, teaching perhaps not early science, but those are coming along, those sorts of things. They're all pretty good at what they do. What we really need is we need to match them with this focus on self-regulation and attention and emotion and executive function in ways that allow for children to take up the information and use the information in productive ways. So that's a question. That's a hypothesis. I don't know that that's the case, and I might get into trouble with some people in early education who feel like that's not true. I don't know. I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm not a curriculum and instruction guy. But that would be sort of my suspicion. And I think some people in education agree with me. I think Bob Pianta, if you're familiar with Robert Pianta, he's the dean of the School of Education at the University of Virginia, who developed the class instrument. And I think Bob's take is pretty much, curriculum this, curriculum that. We know pretty well how to do that. What we don't know, and for Bob, we know less well how to run an effective classroom. We know less well how to organize and manage classrooms. So that would sort of jive with my talk.
Well, that leads into the question I was going to ask with regard to the workforce development piece.
Yes.
So when we start to look at, we can have all these resources and curriculum and programs, but speaking to the adult capacity piece. So
Yeah.
my question is with regard to what have you seen with regard to this area of workforce development that gets to the adult capacity around executive function and self-regulation, whether they be the practitioner, the home visitor, a volunteer who's, say, doing coaching with a parent,
Yeah.
as well as on that continuum with childcare workers,
Yeah.
staff and teachers.
Exactly.
So what are you seeing, or is there something there or elements that can
Right.
come through to maybe break through what you're saying in terms of this resources that we have in the curriculum, but in actual fact we need to speak to adult capacity?
That's great. And the short answer is not much, right? And I think I would love to see, and I think it's a sort of perennial problem. I come from a school of education. Education is only one word in our school's name, but really that's what we are, Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. And we struggle constantly with teacher training. What sort of experiences, what sort of information are we providing to teachers in ways that are leading to action? And I feel like maybe this information is one really mechanism that we could do it, but we haven't tried workforce development around that. I'm also talking with a woman, if you're familiar with Jack Shonkoff's Center for the Developing Child at Harvard University. So Jack is a big proponent of these sorts of models and is very active in sort of getting the word out, so to speak, through his organization, Frontiers of Innovation. And he's been talking, Jack's most recent thing is definitely workforce development. So we've been talking with, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the history of jobs training programs and the evaluation of jobs training programs is pretty dismal for the most part. They have not worked well. It's a shame and a puzzle because they're so important. And we're spending a lot of resources on them, and it's a key thing. Perhaps executive function self-regulation and approach to workforce training through this model might be effective. We don't know, but that's we're beginning discussions with actually agencies in the U.S. at the federal level who are overseeing workforce training with an idea that they want to know more about executive function. So those conversations usually begin with, what is this executive function stuff? Yeah, so it's a process, but that's a great question.
We have another question over here.
Okay. I came across some research looking at kind of cultural shifts in kind of children's lives and expectations of children.
Mm-hmm.
And so over the last few generations, we've seen that children are spending more time kind of doing supervised activities, whereas a few generations ago, children were, playing independently. They were expected to kind of organize themselves and even expected to make meaningful contributions to the family or the community.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, one thing that made me wonder is, like, as those expectations have gone away, have those natural supports for self-regulation kind of resulted in some of the problems that we're seeing? And are these intervention programs kind of trying to replace what we used to have kind of in our communities?
That's a great question, and I have no idea what the answer is. But that is a wonderful point, and I think, I don't know of data to address that specifically, but anecdotally that does seem to be the case. I mean, even my own experience growing up relative to my children's experience, and my children, we were in Pennsylvania when they grew up, but it's still, I seem very different from my experience growing up because it was more under my own direction for a large part of the time. And I think that might be one place. We had the question about resources or community efforts or those sorts of things. I mean, we have very legitimate concerns about the safety and security of our children. There's no question about that. But to some extent, is the tail wagging the dog when we get to these things, right? I mean, we really need to allow children to explore on their own, to do sorts of things on their own. And I don't know that we can create a cultural shift back to that, but I think that would be very important if we could.
Okay. I do have a question for Clancy. In
Yeah.
thinking about the stress levels, you sort of indicated in your work that there might be sort of a level of stress that's actually pretty good. It sort of
Yeah.
motivates us, it keeps us going. And if you're thinking about kids growing up in the context of disadvantage,
Yeah.
what might be some indicators that a level of stress is okay, and what might be some indicators, I can think for service providers maybe working with some of these families,
Yeah.
what would maybe be an indicator that this stress is just sort of past that threshold?
That's
If
a
you could
really
think of
good.
anything.
That's a really good question. I think, and just anecdotally from that, I don't see, but in New York City, when I see kids and they're acting up and they're exuberant in certain ways in public spaces, and then they get clamped down on by their parents pretty severely, right? Like, just stop that instantly. I think that's an indication of children are experiencing stress in ways that are sort of not productive. But whereas if they were in a situation where clearly they're excited and happy or doing something that's sort of suggests to me that their sort of stress levels are up and engaged, in ways to sort of work with that exuberance and work with that sort of enjoyment in ways that are productive rather than clamping down. And this sort of links back to the parenting behavior. What do you do in the supermarket or on the subway or on the bus when your child's acting up in certain ways? That's another way in which if we could get some parenting information out there or strategies out there that are more sort of publicly available. And I'm even thinking of like cereal box type messages or stuff like that. You know, parent possibly, we could try it, the extent to which that might work. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there any other
Question up
question?
there.
Question up here.
Thank you. This is more of an observation that was striking me as you were speaking than it is a question. For other reasons, recently I was trying to locate the background information on adventure playgrounds.
Huh.
And whether they still existed, and if so, where and in what form, and what roles do neighborhoods play in supporting or fostering adventure playgrounds.
Yeah.
Adventure playgrounds in history were free play areas filled with wonderful stuff for kids. Cars you could take apart, trees you could climb, things you could build, empty cardboard boxes of all sizes and shapes, paint, clay, on and on and on.
Yeah.
When you search the web right now under that adventure playgrounds, what you find is the term has morphed over into slight variations on it. But when you look at the photos and videos and information on them now, they are all adult structured.
Huh.
They are plastic slides so that kids won't hurt themselves with slivers. They are predetermined play areas and activities within nicely crafted parks and trees and greenery.
Right.
But, and there are kids playing on them, but the kind of play, my speculation is, would be dramatically different in these arranged environments. There are a few of the historically traditional playgrounds still around. Interestingly, there are a couple in England, there is one in Canada, there are a couple in the States, and there is a proliferation in Denmark, some of the other Scandinavian countries. You know, we could have guessed that, I think.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be fun to research the activities going on in those and the degree to which they appear to, anyway, reflect executive functioning promotion?
I so agree.
And I think my speculation is, well, actually there's some information on this, that in North America, the adventure playgrounds died a rather ugly death when communities rose up and said they were too messy. They destroyed the look of the environment, and there was a period of time when the adventure playground enthusiasts tried putting big fences up around so that you couldn't see the mess. But that didn't last very long, and they essentially disappeared.
That's really a wonderful observation. It puts me in mind of two things. One is there has been some study of what's referred to as liminal spaces that children play in. And so what I'm thinking is of like the vacant lot or the space behind the building or the alleyway, which are these great spaces that children love to inhabit and explore, which don't seem very interesting to adults, right? Or very messy, and we don't actually want kids in there sometimes, but kids love these sorts of spaces. And there's probably those are probably fewer and far between, not in existence, but children's opportunities to engage with them and play in those, for sure. And then the other thing that I do like is just the focus on play, which is so central and essential here. It's been a difficult thing to study, I think. Play, it's been hard to sort of capture or categorize as a construct, as a measurable construct, so we don't have a lot of research on it. But I think in that instance, we fall back on theory and things like adventure playgrounds. Like we could say, if we were able to institute several of these in a certain community, would we see changes at the community level in self-regulation outcomes for kids opposed to a very similar control community? That would be a very interesting experiment to do.
This is just more of a comment. In Victoria on the coast, there's now, I think this year they've opened up a couple sort of nature-based kindergartens. And so there was a big lineup for these kindergarten classrooms, but it's really about thinking how we can move the children back out to sort of these nature places and help them learn.
Yeah.
And so I'd be curious on your sort of thoughts on whether you think that this might be one way of supporting children's sort of self-regulation, or if it's going to differ from a traditional type program.
I would love that. Are people familiar with these forest schools, preschools? They're conducted completely outside, usually in Scandinavian countries, and weather not dissimilar to Alberta's, right? In which kids are outside all day, and there is no interior classroom. It's all the learning takes place outside, and it's all play-based. And there, someone sent me a link to one of these the other day, and I was fascinated by it. It made me instantly wish I was a preschooler once again and could go back and inhabit one of these forest schools. That would be wonderful. But that's what I think the idea is here, and maybe this is the sort of natural process in which I think these schools have been around for some time, but it's really starting to catch on in a bigger way. And I wouldn't be surprised if they show up in North America in a bigger way before too long.
Well, thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
the webcast.